this semester from UNAM, where he is a professor in the School of Architecture. Okay, great. So before I pass it to Brad Horn to introduce William in greater detail, I want to say a couple of things. The first is our land acknowledgement. And I want to say that we at the Spitzer School of Architecture, grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, is situated upon the ancestral homeland of the territory of the Munsee, Lenape, Wappinger, and Wiskajek peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obligated to know the histories of the dispossessed that have allowed the City College of New York to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. So I'd like to add a couple of things to that too. First, to take a moment, with all due respect to William and his time, to celebrate the work of our students that was just published on DZine. So folks, please take a look at it. I'm just scrolling through it real quick to see like the awesome work that's going on in Laura Wayner's core 3 and what's been going on past couple of years in advanced studios, landscape architecture, urban design, master's program, advanced studio with Professor Stitzgart back there, core studio, undergrad core studio, working with spiders. Some of you have done already. Another graduate of the program, graduate student in the master's program. Another advanced studio with Professor Melendez. Another graduate program student under Nandini Baigchi. And there we go. So please take a second to look us up and scroll through the wonderful work of our students. The last thing I want to say is on a very practical level, and that is simply, as many of you know, we have returned to offering continuing education credits for those of you who are architects. I will put these outside right now, so you're able to sign up on your way out for those of you who would benefit from these. So I will now give the floor to Associate Professor and former Interim Dean Brad Horn.
Hey everyone, how are you? Hey, good to see you. Okay. So, great to see everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Thank you, Sean. Where are you, Sean? Thank you for your comments. So I want to start by thanking Dean Gutman, who's not here with us tonight, for putting together, and the administrative staff for putting together this lecture series, and for inviting me to introduce William. I was asked to introduce William because in my former role as MR program director, I worked with Ali Hochek and Martin Stigsgaard on a travel studio where we brought students down to the southern border of Mexico and traveled throughout Mexico, which was really part of their research into the kind of complex landscape of migration, where we raised the question of what is it that architecture can do, what is it that architects can do to make positive change, positive difference in that context. I'm not certain we answered anything, but we can address that in the conversation tonight. During that time, we had the pleasure of meeting William, who was stationed down in UNAM and whose own scholarly research has focused on issues of migration for some time. He has been a friend to the school ever since, offering lectures, speaking to students, contributing writing and research over the past several years, as Ali and Martin have continued their work on the topic. Most recently, as you know, William has joined us here as a visiting scholar, and is here for us, I think, for the whole semester, right? Maybe next semester, possibly too. And so I want to once again thank Dean Gutman for supporting William in this endeavor, and thank Martin and Ali for initiating the process of getting him over here. So William studied architecture, first studied architecture, then got a master's in historiography, and then went on to get his doctorate in the history and theory of architecture from Nacional. So he's no joke. He's currently professor of philosophy and theory at UNAM as well. And I have to say, in preparing for this introduction, and quite frankly, not being a scholar in many of the subjects that William so brilliantly addresses in his research and writing, I thought I would just share a brief observation, which might offer a point of orientation as we listen to his talk. What personally struck me and strikes me about his work is its effort to hold both the expanded geopolitical field of migration and the nature of the individual human subject moving through that field in his mind at the same time. As I read his work, I kept thinking of Alfred Hitchcock's famous dolly zoom shot, which is that cinematic technique that Hitchcock made famous in 1958 in his film Vertigo, where to express a sense of psychological disturbance or anxiety a character may be experiencing, he would simultaneously dolly the camera back from the person, from the subject, while zooming his lens in towards the subject, effectively keeping them the same size while the environment or the field of view in the background expands. This difficult and simultaneous zooming in and out in William's work was meaningful to me because as architects, we seem to be oddly divided between those interested in systems and networks on one hand, and those committed to the human subject or the body to experience on the other. It's as if we struggle to hold both of these scales in our minds at once. Perhaps it's because they each seem to require different terminology, different means of representation, perhaps even different political frameworks. In William's writing, we see a valuable example of a form of thinking that bridges between the immediacy of more tangible architectural concerns and the Archimedean viewpoint of the philosopher. So while William's interests expand in scope to critiques of capitalism, to issues of territoriality, there's a simultaneous focusing of his lens on what he calls the migrant body, on the phenomenology of perception, on the immediacy of experience, and in turn on the problem of movement and what motivates it, such that, like in Hitchcock's Vertigo or in that famous scene in Jaws where Roy Scheider sort of freaks out because he witnesses a shark attack, as the camera pulls back while the lens zooms in William's work, there is what can only be described as an unsettling perspective distortion, one that results in an intense level of emotion, and one that in the end seems only appropriate for the difficult contexts he is taking on. We're very lucky to have William, and I want to give him a round of applause as he comes to it.
Thank you very much, Brad, for that introduction. And now everything after that will be very disappointing. So first, I'd like to thank the Spitzer community, all of you who have been very kind in having me here with open arms. So I thank you all. I thank Brad. Brad for that introduction and also for starting all the motions to have me here. Obviously, Marta, who couldn't be here tonight. Sean, who has been incredibly kind, Ali and Martin, who have kind of been my anchors here. So thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is about beauty. And I know that seems kind of weird, but if you think about it, beauty is in a way one of the most important concepts of Western thought. And in the other way, it's very common. It's a word we use every day without thinking about it very much. It's in our everyday language. But as Barbara Cassin has said, beauty is really in the very foundation of Western thought. When one thinks about education in Western thought, it really has a lot to do with beauty. Education is an act of shaping culture as we know it, should never be thought, says Barbara Casson, without form or figure. There's always a way to see or to hear or to sense culture and education and thought. And in that sense, we kind of is that a word in English? Banalized, made banal, I don't know, made banal in our everyday language and the way we use beauty, right? Oh wait, you need the thingy to pass. Okay, sorry about that. So the interesting thing here is that modern societies, especially let's say 200 years ago till now, have been kind of bent on taking beauty seriously. So they make it something that can be popularly talked about, maybe vulgarized, but we don't really discuss it that much in serious terms. And I think that speaks a lot about our society. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, what I'm going to talk about today is a work in progress. So there may be holes here and there. I apologize in advance. I'm still working on it. I'll try to not name drop as much. But if any of y'all want the direct citations or whom said what or where and when, feel free to ask me later or now. You can just raise your hand. I don't care. So the third thing is I will be working in the sort of constellation. So we're kind of be going from here to there, and then it'll be up to all of us to put it together at the end. So I also ask for your patience, especially in what has to do with migration, because that will come all the way at the end. So it's kind of what joins everything together. Also, as I just said, if you want to interrupt, please do. I know we're not used to doing that, but sometimes interrupting really makes things go. So if you have any doubts or want to say anything, just shout it or raise your hand or whatever. I don't care. It actually makes these things better, right? So let me see if this works. No, got it. There we go. So again, right? If you think about it, the ideas or the concepts for, can we see this right, or should I go like here? That's the same, or is it better? Okay. So again, just to bring back this point, the ideas that conceptualize Western beauty really are everywhere in like the basis of the foundations of what we think, whether we know it or not. It's present in our everyday talk, it's present in our memes, and we kind of interact with beauty every single day. So to have a better understanding of these foundations, really old foundations of beauty, I want to start off with a question for y'all, and I just want you to think, what is it that moves you to action, right? So I don't know, whatever you want to think about, going to have breakfast or going to work or university or whatever, there's something that moves you to that action, right? And the question's a bit tricky, because what I want you to think, it's not about how you move, because how you move has been very easily answered by other fields, right? Kinematics, neuromechanics, physics, thermodynamics. That has to do with the real how these things are moving, but the why you move, or what it is, what the cause is for movement, that's different, right? And that is a question that has been left for not science, but other fields. And what I want to introduce you to, or where I want to start, is with this quote, which is not an exact quote, but I've kind of modified it to make it a bit more accessible, right? And it says, appetite causes movement, and the animal is what is moved. So This quote is actually from, again, it's a much more complicated quote in Aristotle, but I've made it a bit more easy to read here. So what he's saying is, what is moved, the animal, what is moved, humans, animals, whatever, that's the mechanics we were talking about, but there's something before that, right? There's something that causes that movement. And Aristotle will call this appetites, right? So appetites, what is an appetite? We have many names for it, and obviously each one of these little names means something different in the history of Western thought, right? But let's just bunch them all together here to make this easier. You know, appetite, desire, want, inclination, drive, lust, whatever. What matters here is that even though we don't recognize it, in the ways that we think and express ourselves in our language, there's kind of a hierarchy of appetites. There's kind of like a hierarchy of wants, of inclinations. And the way we think about it, the more up you go in this hierarchy, the more human you are, right? And again, I'm not saying we do this consciously, but it's kind of right there in the way we've thought of in Western societies for centuries, right? So what Aristotle did is built like a little pyramid, right, of the different ways in which we have appetites. And then this pyramid was, I don't know if this is the correct word in English, I'm sorry, but this pyramid is incremental, like you go adding things to it, and when you add things to it, it becomes better, right? So what he's saying is that at the beginning, for you to have appetite, you need to have senses. You need to have, you know, 5 senses, sensory perception, whatever. And what he says is basically all animals have that, right? So all animals that move in a very first or very primary way of moving are moving just because they have this, like, what would you call it? Como, like cause and effect, right? So you just feel something you want to move towards or you want to move away from, right? Just because you have senses, and that's it. Then he says there's like a second level. And then the second level, not all animals have it, just some animals have it, right? And that's sensory, let's call it sensory imagination. Again, the names are more complicated, but that means that you're able to retain something that felt appealing or nice or desirable, or in the other way, something that felt unappealing or dangerous or whatever, and you're able to like keep it, right, and reproduce it. That's why it's called imagination, because you can reproduce that image, right? So the animals who can do this, right, their appetites don't have to do with immediate sensation, like what we would call reflex. That's I think that's the way we call it, right? Like immediate, like reflex. But when you can imagine things, and when you can reproduce that image of what is either pleasurable or what is unpleasurable, you know, you go to it, you move to it, or you move away from it, then that's a second level, right? Sensory imagination. And Aristotle calls that irrational appetite. So think about it like lusting, or the way we understand lust, right? If you think about it, we really think about lust as being very irrational, or that's the way we've thought about it. So that's just reproducing in your mind an image of something that causes you pleasure, and then moving towards that, okay? Or reproducing in your mind an image of something that caused you pain or that caused you disgust, and then moving away from that. So that's what's moving you, right? You have it in your mind, you can reproduce it. But the important thing here for the 2 levels is that what's moving you towards or away from an object is an image in your mind, not the actual thing, right? So that's what makes this animal a little bit better than the animal. I don't think it's better. I'm not a speciesist. I'm just saying Aristotle thought it was better. So he thought that was better because, you know, it's one more step up, because you can imagine. So that was irrational, what we would call, you know, lust, whatever. And then the last one was calculative imagination. Only humans, said Aristotle, had this. So what humans have he thought that other animals don't have, I don't know if we're sure about that, but that's what he thought, is the ability to create images, right? So, and this is not creation ex nihilo, this is just like you could take images together and create a new image, and then that's what you go towards, okay? And for Aristotle, this is huge because that is the ability for humans to produce the good. I have no idea if this sounds the same in English as in Spanish, but like the good, lo bueno in a society, like what a society should go to, what is good, what is moral, maybe that would be easier. It's a fabrication, something that we make out of different things, and that's what we use our imagination to do. So again, it's this little like pyramid, okay? And you just add things. So everybody has sensory feelings, and all animals move towards and away from those things that cause them pleasure or disgust. And a next level also have, right, sensory imagination. So they have the ability to retain and reproduce. And then only the highest kind of animals have this calculative imagination. Again, I'm not saying we should agree or not with him. Just keep it in mind because, again, believe it or not, there's something about that still lies deep in the way we're configuring all things, including things that have to do with migration. So have patience with me, please. So it's really funny. You know how your phone is listening to you all the time? And we're all very scared about that. So as I was researching all of this the last couple of months and the last couple of years, my phone would start Instagram would start hitting me with memes that had to kind of do with this. So I just thought I'd share them. The one on the left, if you don't speak Spanish and you don't like cats, you won't get. And if you don't know pan de muerto, which is Mexican, it is amazing, like truly. But the one on the right it's kind of interesting, I think, because again, on the left, you know, they're putting lust as something that's right there. So you're moving towards that object because it's attractive right there in the moment. It's kind of implying that, right? And it's kind of implying that on the right, the object that's there is maybe not immediately attractive. Again, I'm saying implying. I'm not saying that I am not attracted to it. I'm just saying the meme is implying that it is not attractive. But still, the person wants to move towards that, right? So it would have to do with this, and I'm telling you, this man on the left in our culture would be perceived as a lesser man, as a lesser human, not animal, but human, because the one on the right is able to forget about what is right in front of him and put some kind of distance and elaborate another idea of what is good and move towards that. So again, this appeared in my Instagram. I thought it was interesting. So there it is for you, right? So Aristotle's talked about the good, right? What we're able to do is make images or rationality of what is good and move towards those images. So what you have here is two quotes. Two quotes that are basically 2,400 years apart, right? So in his inquiry about the soul or the mind, Aristotle is saying scientific thought by itself does not produce any movement, right? Like just a thought, just a logic will not move at all, right? You have to have that imagination, you have to have that image. So it doesn't matter how wonderful your logic can be, right? Your logic isn't going to move anything. And then a couple of years ago, José Luis Villacañas has a wonderful book on the whole theory behind populism, which I highly recommend. I don't know if it's in English or not, but if you can read Spanish, it's wonderful. He's in my opinion, the best Spanish philosopher there is right now. And when he's trying to explain the whole theory behind populism, he says, reason is I'm reading here when I can read here. Reason is a very limited faculty when it comes to producing social ties. that action, the action of producing social ties, actually corresponds more closely with desire, right? Let's just change that word in there and say corresponds more closely with appetite. So what we have is two quotes about two very smart people, 2,500 years apart, and they're both saying the same thing. Rationality, or pure rationality, pure logos, if you want, pure reason, doesn't move the animal, doesn't move humans, right? It has more to do with appetite, with desire. That's what moves us. Okay, so let's put a pin in that and then come all the way back to today, and to something that a good friend of mine, again, I'm recommending books all around, but a good friend of mine, Ángel Álvarez, who is in Chile right now. It's a beautiful book called Philosophy of Physical Appearance. And he has something that I like to call the beauty paradox. What's the beauty paradox? I want you to think about this. Today, contemporary, present, whatever you want to call it, I don't know, is probably the time in the whole history of human existence where more, let me get this right, where more or the most people have more or the most access to objects and techniques that can produce their physical appearance, right? In other words, today, the production of your physical appearance is more democratic than ever, right? So it's plastic surgery and the price of plastic surgery, but also, as Boris Groys has said, an ex-Soviet philosopher, he says, if you think about it and you look around when you're walking today, every single one of the objects, okay, not everyone, most of the objects that surround you are designed to be beautiful. And that has never happened in the history of humankind, right? I guess since we're all in architecture school, we all love Muji. So, you know, when you go into Muji, what you find is exactly that, right? Like the pen, the back, every single thing around you is designed with thought to it being beautiful, with thought to it causing a certain type of appetite. So it's not only all the objects around you now. A lot of people hate fast fashion, right? But in a way, fast fashion is also democratizing. I don't know where the accent is on that, but is making the ability for you to buy clothes, different clothes, and combine them more accessible for more people, right? So if it's doing something to the environment, I acknowledge that, and it's not good. But at the same time, it's giving more people more access to the production of their physical appearance, their physical self, right? So that's this moment in time. No, more access for more people because of the cost and because of the technologies and everything to produce yourself or to produce beauty. And at the same time, as Pew Research Center says, and I'm guessing all of you know because this is in our societies, we still see that as something bad, right? So Starr says plastic surgery confessions, right? Like it's something you have to hide. Like it's something bad because you have to hide it. If it wasn't bad, you wouldn't have to hide it, right? So if you have plastic surgery, then you have to you're not allowed to say it, or you know. So it's there for everybody. It's really a democratic value, but in the same way that it's becoming a democratic value, we're saying that it's wrong, or we're saying that it's immoral, or we're saying that it's not something you should desire, right? So this is to understand how we get to this place, to this paradox. What I've prepared to you is a very brief history of the concept of beauty, told as tragedy. Okay, so it's 3 acts. I'm going to try to get through this as fast as possible. But just to remind y'all, the idea of tragedy is that tragic irony means that you try to do something, right? And the very impulse that, or your drive that is making you try to do something results in the exact opposite. So I hate this example, but we'll all get it. It's the very drive that Oedipus is like, I don't want to have sex with my mother, that eventually makes him have sex with the mother. If he wouldn't try so hard to not have sex with his mother, it wouldn't happen, right? So that's the tragic irony. Okay, so first act. In the first act, again, we go back to Plato and Aristotle, right? And in Plato and Aristotle, I just realized I said having sex with your mother a lot, and I hope that's not a problem for the future, but anyway. So in Plato and Aristotle have two different understandings of beauty, but in one way, they're very similar. So for Plato, and I'm going to skim through this quickly because I'm already late to what I want to talk about. The highest form of knowledge, which is Sophia, which is wisdom, is beautiful, right? If you can attain the highest form of beauty, that beauty is the highest form of knowledge, Sophia, that knowledge is beautiful. So what we're seeing in Plato there at the beginning of Western thought is that what is beautiful is not only what you can see, right? Thoughts can be beautiful, morals can be beautiful, obviously objects can be beautiful, persons can be beautiful, a lot of different things can be beautiful, right? And for Plato, Plato's Socrates, the idea of beauty is that when you see a beautiful object, or when you see in Plato's case, it would be more a beautiful person, that perplexes you. And I'm using the word perplex because that's what was in the translation. So I don't know if it's what you say, but it simply like leaves you in awe. But this awe makes you want to go further, to know more. So beauty is this thing that kind of like shocks you and then forces you, or like submits you into reflection, into deeper thought, into going deeper, to going more profound, right? So that's a very interesting way of movement. And I ask for you to just keep that in mind, right? That's a movement. It's forcing you to move, but it's kind of like an inner movement. No, it's a movement of your inner self. And again, just to bring this back, beauty has to do with morals, with ethics, right? So the good that we were talking about also appears as beautiful. The good is beautiful in the beginning of Western thought, right? And in Aristotle, we have a more, I'm not going to say contemporary, but maybe something that we understand more to be beauty, because for Aristotle, beauty is symmetry, basically, right? So what he's doing is he's taking from Pythagoras or the Pythagoreans, again, don't know how to pronounce that correctly, but he's taking from the Pythagoreans and saying that the way beauty appears to you is basically a proportion, right? It's a relation between the parts of a thing or the relation between the parts of a whole. And if those parts are in a numerical, correct orthos relation between themselves, then that thing will appear as beautiful, right? So what do Plato's and Aristotle's conception of beauty have in common? It's one, that beauty is an objective thing, right? It's an objective property. It's not subjective. It's there in the world, and it can appear to you, and it can move you, and it can shock you, right? But it's there in the world. And the other thing is that to understand it, to like really get it, you need to use the mind, not the senses, right? Because in Plato, it makes you go further down, so you need to think about it. And in Aristotle, it's a mathematical ratio, so you kind of like have to get it, right? So beauty appears to everybody, and everybody can kind of participate in beauty, but not everybody can get it, right? So there's kind of a democratic part to it, right? Because beauty is in the world, it's objective, it's for everyone to behold and to feel. But if you want to like use it, then you have to use your mind, okay? And using your mind has to do with those, little pyramid that we saw a while ago. So where is this actually best explained? And I don't know how long I am into this talk, but architecture is finally here. this whole theory is actually best explained in Vitruvius, yeah, okay, book, which I hope you all know because you're here. So 10 books of architecture. So what is beauty in Vitruvius? In Vitruvius, it has an extra element, which is a Lucretian element and a Epicurean element, which we'll talk about right now. But he says beauty basically is a noetic representation of something that exists in the world. So there's beauty in the world, and we use our mind, noetic, to represent it, to reproduce it, right? But again, where is it? It's in nature. It's in the world. It's kind of like a cosmic arrangement, right? So what Vitruvius does is he kind of goes through the rules of how to do it, right? And what's interesting about Vitruvius, and this is a point that is brought up by Paul Guyer, who is a philosopher and aesthetician, I think he's down in Brown in Philadelphia, says when we're teaching architecture, we usually miss the point in Vitruvius in which he is very emphatic on that when you're making a building, designing a building, you should make things appear proportionate for human eyes, right? So this is professors of theory and history. This is why in Greek architecture, you actually have a small deformation in the buildings, right? So that they will appear to the human eye as proportionate and not be proportionate in themselves, right? So it's an objective thing, but that should be catered to human perception, right? So this is a kind of natural approach that sometimes we don't see to Vitruvius because we read Vitruvius through Alberti, which we'll get to in a while, right? So we usually don't miss this, but it's a very important point. Why? Again, because that means that when we're building our cities, or when they were building their cities, they're building them beautiful, not to be beautiful in themselves, but to be beautiful for human perception, right? So it's a beauty that is built for everyone. Again, I know that Greeks, kind of assholes and only men and stuff like that, but there are studies that say that men and women and slaves and everybody could be in the city, and if you could just gaze upon it, again, kind of democratic, right? Everybody that could walk through the city, a city that was designed this way, would at least behold or be a part of this beauty, right? So if we put this all together with what we were talking about, Aristotle and Plato, in the end, beauty is really what human life is about. Because when you're going in the pyramid, right, this imitation, this imagination, this reproduction, that's what separates humankind from the rest of the animals. And don't agree with it. My cat is very smart, so I'm not sure, but this is what they were saying. Okay, so who was beauty for? Beauty was for the many and for the few at the same time, right? It was there for everybody to behold, but only a couple of people could really grasp it and use it, right? And lastly, just to get rid of the Greeks, in Vitruvius, an architect, beauty is a mandate, and this is very important. It's not an option, right? If you want to do architecture, it's not either or. It's firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, right? That's what makes why? Because again, this is what human life is about. That's what makes us human. The beautiful is what makes us human. I always use this example with my students, and again, this is kind of specious, and so don't hold me to it. It's just so we all understand. Help me out. What's the name of the animal with the dams and the rivers and the beavers? Thank you. Beavers, firmitas, utilitas, right? Birds with a nest, firmitas, utilitas. I have no idea what other animals, because I'm blanking right now, but there's a lot of animals that get the firmitas and the utilitas thing done. But only a humankind in this thought makes those things also beautiful, right? With this power of imagination that supposedly only we have. So that is a mandate, because that mandate makes human living in human places worthwhile. Okay, so this idea of beauty as objective, as everywhere in the world to have, to behold, etc., is what Tatarkiewicz calls the great theory of beauty, right? It's a beauty that's that, as I said, is objective, and that you can imitate or derive its rules for it. And will probably have its best moment, or let's say higher moment. No, I can't say higher because I'm going to say higher after that. Okay, higher moment in the late medieval times. Okay, why? Because beauty will acquire a mystical kind of nature. Okay, so what does it mean for beauty to become mystical? Okay, it means it becomes an intensive quality, and we can see this in the work from Augustine of Hippo all the way up to Tomás de Aquino. So what these guys are doing, and again, I'm not a fan of the Catholic Church. Don't think about it this way. I know they've done horrible things. I think so too. Not a fan of their work, but particularly when it comes to beauty, or to this conception of beauty, what they're doing throughout the Middle Ages and into the late Middle Ages is that they're bringing the body into it, right? So what they're doing is they're equating beauty with something you can feel. And they're doing it because even though we're not taught about it this way, but the medieval times, yeah, that sounds like a restaurant, but medieval times are actually a very highly democratic society or time in Western thought. If you haven't had the chance to read Silvia Federici's work, Caliban and the Witches, it's a beautiful work about gender and the way that around the Middle Ages there's a shift into a less democratic and more aristocratic way of living. Great work. And what she's basically saying is Middle Ages are actually pretty democratic, and actually a lot of people had a lot of power in them because of certain, structure that had to do with the plague and people and stuff like that. But what we can see in the cathedrals, in the construction of a cathedral, is that their idea, especially Tomás de Aquino's idea, is that beauty is intensive, right? So it's something that goes up. And the most intensely beautiful thing is the most perfect thing, and that's God, right? But that means that every single thing in his creation is to some level beautiful. And the more beautiful something is, then the closer it is to God, right? Again, not a fan of the Catholic Church, just telling you what they said, right? But you have to accept that when you're in a Gothic cathedral, you get this, right? Beauty is something that you sense. So what they're doing is they're taking this whole mental thing about beauty that was going on in classical Greece, right? And they're making it more accessible for everybody because they're making it something that you can just feel. And the way they're trying to get you to feel, right, the utmost beauty, the closest you can to beauty and to perfection is a Gothic cathedral, right? So, I mean, we don't get that sense anymore when you walk into it, but it used to be the light and the smell and the walking and the changes of temperature. It was a completely corporeal experience, and it was a corporeal experience of beauty. So that meant that as long as you can walk into a cathedral in Europe, you could be the closest you could be to perfection, to moral perfection, which was beautiful. Could be the closest you could be to God, right? So this is, whether we like it or not, probably the highest pinnacle of democratic beauty, of a beauty that's accessible to all and understandable to all, because you don't have to think about it anymore. You can just feel it, right? When you walk into this cathedral. So that, right, basically is the high point of this first act. If you want like further reading on this mystical thing about, basically this is in Bolívar Echeverria's work, the idea that inspired Walter Benjamin's aura, right? So the creation of aura has to do with this particular moment in medieval times, right? So, but let's not stop there. And then, so Act 2, right? So this is the way we get beauty like kind of established. And we have to skip a Renaissance, because the Renaissance, and I'm guessing you're all very good at this, is basically a return to a very mental conception of beauty, right? So Alberti's Vitruvius, right? It's going to be exactly the same, but he's going to invent this word called conchinitas, which is a completely mental way of accessing beauty. It's completely mathematical and it's completely mental. And here's where the tragedy starts, because they're doing it, right, in a very democratical way. What they want to do is, little by little, to wrest away power from the church and to give it back to man or human, right? That's why humanities, right? But what I want you to see is that this eventually will turn out exactly the opposite. So we have to skip Alberti and the Renaissance, right? And we have to go straight to Hume and Kant. So we have to go straight to 17th and 18th and 18th centuries, right? So Hume and Kant are basically subjectivists, right? So what they're saying is beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So what pleases you depends on everyone, and what you think is beautiful because you find it beautiful and because you believe it to be beautiful. It's a very millennial, centennial way of understanding the property of beauty, right? Whatever you think about it, it's okay. But they both recognize that this would bring a problem with what they call solipsism, right? So the example I always use with my students is there's nothing different between that and saying that I am seeing a huge blue cookie-eating monster in that corner over there, right? And so if I'm saying that I'm seeing it and sensing it, then you would all not be able to tell me it's not there because, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder. So what they come up with is something called the antinomy of taste, which is really a very interesting thing. The one you're reading right here has to do with the Kantian invention of it. So an antinomy is two laws that are exactly opposite to each other, but they're both true, right? And this is permitted in weird ass logic. So the first one they're saying is, of course, right? Whatever you think is beautiful or whatever you think pleases you, and nobody can tell you that that's not right, right? So nobody can tell you that what you think pleases you or that what you think is beautiful is not. But at the same time, and this is a really interesting part, he says, when we speak about things that are beautiful, and we like to speak about things that are beautiful, right? We do so to get approval, right? So think about when you're exiting from seeing a movie, right? And you go to the person you went to see it with, and you're like, that was a good movie, or that was a beautiful movie, or whatever. You're not saying that just to have the other person recognize that you thought it was good or beautiful. You want approval, you want, or censorship, you want to discuss it, right? So they realized it, right? That's why he says we would not quarrel about it. So he said, at the same time, beauty is completely subjective, but I know, and we know that we quarrel about what things are beautiful, right? So that's the whole antinomy of the thing, right? On the one side, we're accepting that it's completely subjective, but on the other hand, at the same time, we're also accepting that when we speak about it to others, right? It's so that we can come to some sort of agreement on what is or what is not beautiful, right? So this has a social function, okay? So what does this mean for our tragedy? Well, the idea is that this impulse of trying to make it completely subjective for everyone and for everyone to judge meets kind of like a wall, right? And now, while it's completely subjective, we still talk about it. We still talk about beauty. And since we're still talking about beauty and we're demanding the other person's approval or not, or censorship of what we think what is beautiful, then there has to be some sort of rules, or we have to make up some sort of rules, right? Because if we don't, then again, completely subjective. So it's very interesting that this impulse or this force, this democratic force that was trying to take the power away from the priests, right? Because only the priests and the religious were telling us what was beautiful, is tried to take it away from them and make it for everybody. That same power now creates its own case. So the priests don't determine what is beautiful anymore, or whatever, right? But who does now? So the new case is the case of the critics and the geniuses. So the critic and the genius are basically being born at this time, right? The genius is the artist who can produce beauty, and the critic is basically the voice we all listen to, or we all agree with, when he or she says that something is beautiful, right? So that's why I like to frame it like a tragedy, because it's really trying to make it for everybody with subjectivity, but in that own impulse, it itself is creating a new caste, a new aristocracy of beauty. Okay, so the question, so that this, if you don't know this, this is a Richter word, which is always used in these examples, because it has to do with man looking at nature and then going into self-reflection, right? So why are these rules created? Again, to determine, but also to say which works of art are beautiful, and those that are beautiful cause us to, in the Platonic sense, think and reflect about ourselves. It causes us to move into ourselves. So that's why the work of Gottfried Richter is so important, because I think his name is Gottfried Richter. Hope I'm not massacring that. No, you sure? Caspar Friedrich. Thank you. Who's Gottfried Richter? Oh no, it's another author. Sorry. Thank you. Caspar Friedrich. So all of his work has to do with this, right? The idea of looking into beauty, or in this case, since it's a romantic work, profundity or sublimity or whatever, and thinking, self-reflecting, becoming a better person. So again, it's a turn into the subjective, right? But even though we're going to the subjective, again, we have critics, we have artists, we have geniuses, right? So who makes up these new rules? Well, critics and artists, basically. Right. So again, since we're in a school of architecture, these two quotes are from architectures, 17th and 18th century. One of them, Antoine Lepatre, says the rules of art are based on reason. The other one, Amédée François Flessier, a bit more, what would we say, dictatorial, says architectural orders should be enslaved to the laws of reason. Right. Again, we're trying to make it to everybody, but at the same time, we're creating rules that are allowing only a few people to determine what is and what is not beautiful, and therefore, what is part of this education that I was talking about at the beginning, right? If you want to educate yourself as a correct human being, then you have to see the correct works and understand the correct rules, etc., etc. So it's becoming by itself an aristocracy, right? So that brings us to Act 3. What happens, right? So to the professors in the front, this is an artist of reggaeton. To the students in the back, that's Beethoven. And I was doing this with a mouse, but so basically, what happens is we have to think in the 19th and 20th centuries about what these rules mean with the coming of mass media and mass culture. Right. So what's happening? There's every more an increased importance for subjectivity, right? There's also an increased focus on the irrational. Remember, we're discovering with Freud and other writers, thinkers, we're discovering that there's a thing called the subconscious, unconscious irrationality, etc., etc. Right? So that's also coming about, and art is becoming this place where I contemplate and where I become, quote unquote, a better human being, right? So because of all of this, beauty is not talked about anymore. So we won't hear that much about beauty we'll start hearing about aesthetic experience, right? Because not only beauty will let you be a better person, right? Also, the sublime can get you to be a better person. Also, the monstrous, the profound, all these romantic things, but they all have to do with the mind, right? It's a sensory, it can be a sensory experience, but it always has to be thought of in order to make you a better person. It sounds like a self-help book, but you know, I can't help it. So the rules, right, that these people are making become every time more complex. If you've ever read an aestheticist work from the late 19th century or a vanguardist work from the early 20th centuries, you'll understand how complex these rules are starting to become, right? So these rules as aesthetic experiences are becoming more complex and more complicating at the same time that mass culture is rising. So at the same time that we're finding more rules that tell us that Beethoven is the best, right? Rosalia and Bad Bunny are existing. Well, not Rosalia and Bad Bunny, but let's think early 20th century, Adorno hated jazz, big band jazz. So let's think big band jazz and radio and movies. Okay, so the small aristocracy that's still thinking about beauty, about sublimity, about everything, and that's making its rules, they're making more complicated. Less and less people are understanding it, but they're still saying that this is what you need to understand and perceive and think about to become a cultivated person, a real human being. And at the same time, people are being moved by something else, right? They're being moved by radio. Maybe they're being moved by movies. I just got that movie thing, but yeah, movies, and they're being moved by popular culture, right? So I just want to make a pause to bring it back to what we were talking about, because it's very important. How does the aristocracy of taste think about it? I was going to tell you to think about it, so now I'm confused. So you think about how the aristocracy would think about, or think about anybody who has very good taste thinks about it. They're going to tell you that reggaeton and Marvel movies and whatever are baser tastes. They have more to do with immediate pleasure. They have more to do with you moving towards whatever gives you pleasure or away from whatever gives you distaste, and that makes it a lower thing, right? So we're back at Aristotle without knowing it, because as I told you, it's in the very foundations of Western thought. It's right there, right? So that's the way we're thinking about it. So how does this aristocracy of taste justify its saying that only Beethoven will make you a better person and not Bad Bunny? They'll say, because you only want to listen to Bad Bunny because it gives you immediate gratification. It's baser, it has more to do with beats, it has more to do with sex, it has more to do with lust, when you should really, right, be imagining these things that only human imagination can do, which is the good, which can only be thought about, which is loftier, which is there, which is again, right, the bed and the two guys and the two women. That's what you should be worried about, right? Not the other thing. So when that's confronted with mass culture, we have a problem, right? Because most people, and I think I will include everybody here, we like a good reggaeton and a good Marvel movie, and you know, everybody loves Bad Bunny. So it creates a problem in an age of say, democracy, right? So to end this tragedy, let's go to the 20th century. This is what happens. Remember, they try to make it more democratic, and it ended up being exactly the opposite. That's a tragic irony of it all. We're going to end up back in architecture with, again, Paul Gouyer, the philosopher. So what he says is what happens in architecture, and architecture is important because it's actually the best example we have to understand what's going on in all the arts and society, and etc. Because again, architecture is it's cosmetically bringing everything together because of its mandates, right? It has to be functional, it has to be economic, but also has to be beautiful, etc. So architecture is a great place to understand what's going on. So Paul Guyer says basically from the late 19th century till today, right? All architects do or not acknowledge the fact that firmitas and utilitas, functionality and what would we call that in English? Not falling.
Durability.
Durability. So durability and functionality are necessary conditions of architecture, but not sufficient. So you need them, but if you have them, that doesn't make it architecture, right? What makes architecture sufficient? Beauty, right? Venustas. So he says basically from the 19th century to today, architectural theory, which is very representative of society, has been thinking about ways to think about beauty after durability and functionality, right? What to do with beauty. So what Guyer does is he draws a very, let me see, okay, here we go. He draws a very nice, very clean line from John Ruskin to Adolf Loos to Mies van der Rohe, in which he says what we have been doing in modernity in this attempt to make the mental beauty, the profound beauty, the one that can only be accessed by few, the real beauty, the valuable beauty, is that they have been thinking as beauty as something that is a pure abstract value, right? And therefore, ornament, ornament is crime, but that's too easy. Ornament will always be thought as something that deceives you or conceals real beauty, right? So again, Bad Bunny, ornament, Beethoven, pure beauty, right? I know all the ways we say this in Spanish. I don't know how you say it in English, but we actually have a lot of sayings about this. Like I'm guessing,
Say it, I'll try
well, obviously la belleza es interior, like real beauty is interior, but also es no juzgues un libro por la portada. That's also in English. Yeah. Don't judge a book by its cover. Like covers, ornaments, things that you put on top. Oh, don't y'all have something that's like flash and substance or something like that?
There's what?
All flash and no substance. That's a saying, right? Yeah. So flash, cover of the book, whatever, everything that's on top. It's concealing you and it's deceiving you from the real beauty, which is pure within, in the case of architecture, structural, right? And actually has some very interesting ways of happening. For example, in Barragán, you will find in academic sources two ways about understanding Barragán, right? Some people will actually tell you that Barragán is bringing color and is bringing light and is bringing senses into something that's very geometrical and abstract. But I would hold that, and other people would hold that it's exactly the opposite. But it's simply including color into those pure values, right? That are completely in Barragán. Color is not something you paint on. It's something that's complete part of the structure, and therefore it's part of that purest view of what real beauty is, right? So that's not too far away from what's happening in the arts in the United States, right? So if you've been up to Via Beacon recently, on the left, there's a beautiful exhibition on the work of Robert Ryman. And obviously in MoMA, there's always, I don't know always, but most of the times you can see beautiful art by Barnett Newman, right? So it's again, this idea, this very, I don't know if this is a word in English, but enteleki. It's a very mental, very rational way of understanding beauty, right? And if you get it, I'm not going to say it's not really beautiful. Like if you can go in front of a white square and be like, this is beautiful, right? It's great, but you need like a shitload of education to get that, because if you don't, then you're just like, this is a white square, right? So if you have all of this culture, all of this idea, then that white thing appears as beautiful. If not, you're like, give me my money back. Like, this is ridiculous, right? Or with Barnett Newman or with Rothko or any of these, right? So the question is, do these paintings really move us? And if they do, whom do they move? And if they do they move you to action, or do they just move you to reflection? Right? I'm just going to finish the architectural part with the last part of Guyer's book, in which he takes a book by Rafael Moneo, which is in reserve here in the library. I know some professor reserved it, so good for him or her. So it's a book by Rafael Moneo called Theoretical Anxieties and Design Strategies. And Guyer takes it to exemplify like these two ways that beauty have gone in the ways they are right now, right? So on the left, you have Eisenman's idea of architecture, right? And it will be called by Moneo and Guyer a very syntactic way of understanding architecture and architectural form and architectural beauty. And on the right, obviously, we have the ideas proposed by Venturi. So let's just think about Las Vegas like a decorated shed, right? And he calls that symbolic, right? So again, let's come back to tragedy, right? What's really there for everybody, what's really pleases everybody, what really causes everybody to move, because let's be honest, Las Vegas moves a lot of people, right? It's not deemed the type of beauty that makes you a better person. It's not deemed the good. So if you're moving towards that, you're not moving towards the good. You're moving towards pleasure, satisfaction, out satisfaction, etc. Right? While on the left, right, you have objects that do move, but that move like three of us, right? Maybe here. Like every time you go to a famous modern architect's house, it's like you and other 5 people, and we're all in awe and we all love it, but that's it. It's 5 people, right? So there's 2 different kind of movements, and what we're doing is disregarding that big part of that popular part of movement. In Venturi's work, he says he sides with the silent majority that likes the ugly, right? Obviously, when he's saying the ugly, he's saying what the aristocracy says is ugly, right? Not the majority. The majority goes. Our example in Mexico City is always this horrible museum right next to Jumex. But that's where everybody goes. That's what moves people, and that's what's Instagrammable, and that's what people want to go and take their pictures with, right? So this silent majority is moving because of these objects, and this minority, which is basically all of us and soon to be all of you in the back, are saying that's not orthos, that's not the good. You're moving towards something that's not the good, right? So in the case of Eisenman, right, what he advocates for, this is I think one of the drawings for one of his first houses, the case house, I think. I'm sorry, I'm not really good with that. But what he always says is architecture has to do with those things that can only be perceived by the mind, right? Frontality, obliquity, setbacks, elongations, compressions, shifts. Those are things you can only perceive with the mind, right? And Venturi says, no, hybrid, distorted, ambiguous, conventional, and redundant. The vulgar. That's what it really has to do with. See, those are the 2 paths that we've taken. It's really a very tragic understanding of beauty that we have today, right? So, what moves us to action today? I promised if you had patience with me, we'd get to the whole migration, right? So we're finally here. You have patience. We only lost like 2 or 3 people. Thank you for that. In the politics of understanding migration, there's a very, very deep Aristotelic foundation of how we understand why people move, right? And sometimes it's a bit problematic, right? Because sometimes we think that we're being like very nice and very good people if we say that we're letting people move or we're letting people come in, whether it be the United States or Mexico, because, for example, they are fleeing from danger or from hunger or whatever. That makes us feel good about ourselves. But basically, what we're saying, right, is that we're acknowledging them as irrational animals that need to come in for us to defend them, or for us to give them a better life. Okay, it's not something I'm elaborating. Giorgio Agamben and basically the whole Italian school around Giorgio Agamben have been writing about this a lot. It has to do with biopolitics and it has to do with aesthetics, right? But what we're not doing, right, when we say that people move only because of reflex or because of pleasure, what we do is that we take away their capacity to imagine what is good and to move towards that. When I was in Ali's and Martin's studio, I was asking many of the students, some of them are here, if they had any memories or remembrances of what they moved towards it when they migrated, or what their parents moved towards. And some of the responses were beautiful. I specifically remember one that said the snow. Like, when you were moving towards wherever you were going to go, what was the image of where you were going? And it was snow, right? Sometimes the responses are a better life, right? And then something happens because this aristocracy of taste thinks about a better life in our terms. But sometimes a better life is just commodities. It's just Venancio, who's a friend that works in the bar next to my apartment, says it's an apartment. It's the idea of being able to purchase an apartment. That's it. That's it, basically. So it has to do with all those things that we usually think as baser desires that should not be valid for movement, right? Buying things, seeing snow, being able to have money, being able to send back money. Right? And there's something very perverse about acknowledging this as irrational and also offering our protection, again, being Mexico or the United States, right? If your irrationality is valid, then we'll let you in. We were recently in Tijuana, and that's basically what happens, right? Is you can get asylum as long as you say that you are in fear for your life and that we acknowledge that your fear for life is correct. Right, so we're not saying it openly, but this is at work there, right? We are completely negating their possibility of wanting to move. I'm not saying they're not fearful, some of them are fearful, but there's also this other level, right? That has to do with the possibility to imagine what is good on their terms, on popular terms, right? So to finish, what is moving beauty? Right? Moving beauty can be two things, and this is what I haven't worked out yet, so this seems disjointed. I'm sorry. At the same time, it's that image that generates desire and excites moving humans to move towards it, no matter the distance. This is very important in a time of Instagram and television and etc. Why? Because we're able to produce those images too, and we're able to send those images instantaneously around the globe, or ladder, if you will, whatever you believe, right? And that is the beauty that image is what's going to make you move. It's not something immediate, it's something mediate, right? So that's an image, and we can produce those images. And architecture has a mandate to produce these beautiful images and to decide what is and what is not beautiful in the production of the images, not in the reception, right? There's something that does have to do with the imagination of these beautiful future worlds, right? And the other one is also the beauty of movement. Moving beauty is understanding movement, change, and transformation as something beautiful. And this is also very hard for architecture, because architecture has to do with fixity, with conservation. It's part of its base, right? But it's also in the production of images that we can make moving, change, transformation beautiful. And especially now, for example, with the work of Kathleen Malabou on plasticity, we can now make moving images. We can make images that change, that transform, right? That recognize beauty not in something that is eternal, but recognize beauty in something that is changing and transforming all the time, right? So moving beauty is really democratic beauty. again, just logic, scientific thought will not move anybody, right? I love Eisenman houses, but they're not going to move, or they're not going to cause movement or democratic movement, right? Just thinking about reason by itself is not, or just reasoning by itself will not cause movement, right? So moving beauty has to be democratic beauty. And I didn't get into what the idea of democracy is, because I'd be standing here for more hours, but if you want to chat about it, we can do it, thinking about radical democracy in Rancière's term. But I think it still works in general, in the general understanding. So, whoa, go back. No, had one more image. Just wait. There we go. It's shameless self-promotion, but also is that it's not. I'm guessing here. Yeah. So just, but it's selfless shame promotion, but it's also what you see on the left. This is not something that we're just thinking about. So as some of you know, we are working in a theoretical and practical sense on migration with a studio in Mexico called Studio RX. Gabi and Loretta, which are two Mexico City-based architects, they will be here in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. They'll present this work much better, but we're thinking about these things and how to materialize these things. And our studio on migration is 3 years. The second year is in conjunction with Ali and Martin. But this is just on the left is the work of last year's students. We did Tapachula. We did Tapachula last year. We're doing Tijuana this year. We have no idea what we're going to do next year. But their idea on what to do, they basically just took a part of the train that comes from Guatemala to Mexico, which is called La Bestia, which has some horrible stories. And they just took these tracks and they just made a walkway for the caravans. And one of the most important things was, obviously, your walkway has to work, it has to be functional. It has to be durable. It can't be washed away by the hurricanes. But most importantly, it has to be beautiful. The migrants have to, walking up in a caravan, have to have a sense of beauty in their walk, right? It's not just a base pleasure. It has to be something that recognizes why they are moving, that makes it a beautiful movement. So we're doing that practically too. I don't know if successfully or not. We're trying to. Thank you very much. Ooh, that was pretty good actually. Thank you very much.
Do you folks have questions?
Questions? Commentaries? Yeah.
So I'll be trying to wrap my head around the first half of the presentation. I think I understand the argument of the first half of the presentation, starting with their appetite all the way to like backbutting, right? I'm still struggling to understand how do you tie that into the presentation, the immigration part. Are you making an argument, or are you merely presenting this as information?
Okay. It's a very complicated question and good question. As you can obviously see, the last part is the most problematic. Right now, the specific tie into migration has to do with the way we are representing, and I think architecture has to do with this, we are representing the images or not that move migrants to move, right? So as you have all heard, there's all sorts of migration, right? But mostly migration is understood unconsciously, right? As a base movement, as something that in Aristotelian terms would be akin to the movement of an animal, right? Like we hear it, they're fleeing. And I'm not saying they're not, obviously they are in danger, et cetera, but if you just say it this way, then you're taking away what we unconsciously think are the right ways or the right sources of movement, right? So when you see it in the images in the news, when you see it in the images of the architecture of their places of origin, right? There's always a conscious or unconscious way to make it seem like whatever they are fleeing for or pursuing is not the correct beauty. It's not the good, right? And so I think there's a big danger there that if we think that we are letting these people in or saving them or being nice to them, while at the same time we're thinking that their image is not the correct image, right? There's a perverse thing going on there, and it has to do with the way that we, and this includes architects, also represent what is good, right? So when we had some very interesting thing in Martin's class with what's the name, with Midjourney, right, of the way. So it really has to do with what, as architects, we think is beautiful, the right kind of beautiful, and how we're shaping the imaginary, not real society, because real society is like 80% Las Vegas, right? Or Ecatepec or whatever, right? But the image of this good we're supposed to be going to, which is supposed to be the good, is in complete and absolute contrast, right, with what that silent majority thinks is good, right? So if they're saying, this is going to get canceled, but if, let's just say as an example, a migrant would say, I want to, why do you want to come into the United States? Why do you want to come into Mexico? Because I want a house, and because I want a really cool car and a 90-inch plasma TV, right? We'd probably be like, no, that's not a reason to, that's not the good, that's not a reason to come in, right? Because we know what is good. So there's ways in which you can come in that have to do with that good that we're elaborating. And there's also ways in which you can come in that don't have to do with that good, but then we're like, it's okay because you're fleeing, or because you're hungry, or because you're, basically we're saying because you're lower animals. I have no idea if that had anything to do with what you asked.
Yeah, it does. Are you familiar with the term gatekeeping?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so you're basically drawing a comparison. The same way that people that like art from the 20th century would say, oh, if you like Bad Bunny, you don't really like it. You don't know what art is, right? So that same way architects, well, some architects, like they kind of gatekeep beauty in that same way.
I think so, and I would consider me part of those gatekeepers. I mean, I'm not free from criticism because I've been in this for a while. So you know, you're still mad when somebody goes to see the Excusado in Polanco. Okay, you're still mad when somebody goes see the, what's the thing down there with the thing and the people's suicides. Thank you. Like you're still, you know, like, why would you want to go see that, or why would you want to go visit that, the vessel, whatever, and everything is horrible. But at the same time, people say, yeah, I mean, we're all gatekeeping because it's been like baked into us.
But I mean, to me, I really like your presentation. But to me, the question of structure enters all the time, tries to enter all the time into your presentation, and I wonder how you deal with that, because I think that first in your statement about, in your last statement about migration, I think it's crossed by an ideological. It's a generalization of an ideological state, which is not necessarily true. And then, in that statement, there is, you're claiming that consumption culture is the only possible popular culture, also in aesthetic terms, and that's not necessarily what confronts like the kind of beauty with big B that you are presenting here. I mean, the definition of the popular, movements itself, and even more today, are actually also contesting the, structure. So I'm conflicted in that, in that encounter, in those assumptions, basically.
So just to understand what exactly would you mean by structure there?
So when you're confronting like beauty,
Mhm.
like in Aristotelic term, I'm also, translating myself. It's like the otherness is not necessarily consumption of beauty. It's not necessarily, the beauty that is part of the structure. Popular beauty is also is basically also confronting consumption of beauty. Popular movements and it's the relationship, the cultura popular, la cultura popular, it's not the culture of consumption. It's the, popular culture in the Americas, in other non-Western, non-capitalist expressions of the value of, if you want to name it, an aesthetic experience. So I wonder how, those discussions about structure enter in your preposition.
Yeah. I would remit back to Angel Álvarez's work on this, because the way I see it and the way we see it is that in the moment you immediately make consumer culture or capitalist culture something you must be necessarily against, either to find beauty or emancipate yourself or whatever, you are also ignoring the fact that it is what most people have at hand and what is easier for most people to procure. So for example, the idea of fashion and its very close ties to popular movements, especially let's think about movements of different identities or rights or whatever, is always there, right? So what I think is sometimes this need to try to understand the structure as a whole is maybe something, I'm not going to say evil, but it's not evil, but maybe something that is getting in the way of true emancipation or true beauty or true freedom is a bit in its own way. It's a bit, I mean, we all love, Brechtian theater, and we all love cultura popular in music from the second half of the 20th century. And it's obviously a ways of emancipation, but it usually goes against the possibility of emancipation, beauty, freedom, etc., in those things that every single person, or almost every single person on the planet, has at their disposal, which is commodities, and very cheap commodities. So it's just thinking that it's the idea that we usually disregard any movement that comes from or towards or is built from commodities as necessarily part of the problem. And this is a paradox because it's what everybody has at hand, no? Es lo que todo el mundo tiene a la mano. So that's.
Presenting this as a kind of binary. Sort of there are two ways here. And a question, I feel uncomfortable with that. I think of, it was Mitterrand, the former French president, his I think foreign minister said something that referred to American cultural imperialism, for example. And in this sense in the sense he meant it, the migrant thinking of snow, thinking of the larger TV, let's say, as you describe it, that vision of that thing is also in a sense negating his own culture, her own culture, is a negation. So it's a far more complex, I think, positioning of ourselves. I think of the Caspar Friedrich painting, and that moment of the sublime. It's a moment where he's both awed and frightened by what he sees, but also drawn by a sense of satisfaction and I don't know, empowerment or perhaps beauty. Yeah. In this moment, it is both the outside world and the individual. It's in conflict. You're conflict, I think, is our human condition. This is the human condition of not a clear binary, but of difficulty in a sense, and difficulty not as ugly difficult, or perhaps beauty in another sense is our conflict. The unresolved is actually beautiful in that sense. It makes us take action. It brings wisdom.
Well, I completely agree. I think the point here with two things on what you're saying, Ali. The first one is, this is going to be very unpopular, and I hope you don't hate me about that. But usually, in most cases, the people that are really worried about losing culture aren't the people in the culture, but the people seeing that culture from outside. Right. So I think if you give any person who lives in extreme poverty or precariousness, they can't eat culture, and they can't make money from culture. So people that are trying to, save cultures are usually people who value culture more because they don't need it to eat. Right. So of course, if somebody could, have their culture and eat because of the culture, that would be wonderful. But in many cases, like, that is not the case. And in the part of the dichotomy, I would say that the way, maybe I didn't express it correctly, it's not so much that I'm presenting a dichotomy, but just one side which is not allowing and that side is basically called uniformity, hegemony. In this case, the hegemony of taste, which is very interesting because it's very anachronic to hegemony in economics or in government. But one side that is basically saying, you can have whatever culture you have, or whatever cultural production you have, or whatever beauty you have, but that is not the correct beauty, which is orthos. Like, there is still this gatekeeping, I feel, and I'm not saying everybody's doing, but there's still this gatekeeping on a uniformity of taste, right? And what this gatekeeping does is it doesn't set a binary, it just doesn't allow multiplicity, right? Because you can never not gatekeep, because culture is basically a hierarchy in economics. But what that uniformity fears is a little bit that freedom of combination, multiplication, and transformation that can come from what is easily accessible to everybody, right? So it's not that I'm saying that it's a dichotomy. What I'm saying is, of course, Barnett Newman's work is beautiful, and of course it causes movement. I don't think there's any discussions about that. The problem I would see with the gatekeeping is that we're not allowing us to see how, I don't know, BoJack Horseman can also afford you those possibilities, the same possibilities that Barnett Newman can, right? So it's more not recognizing all of that popular culture, including revolutionary popular culture and counterculture, etc., not recognizes as something that's equally valid for the realization of a self and of democratic society than movies, popular movies, and BoJack Horseman and stuff like that. Maybe I didn't express it correctly. Maybe it has to do with more with gatekeeping.
Is there perhaps one last question before we wrap up?
Following up on some similar problem that we have been bringing, the complexity problem and the structure problem, I also feel really unease in the way that I feel the paradigm, the philosophical paradigm that you have been building this wonderful narrative on, in a way that you have been saying that I'm not a fan of Aristotle, I'm not a fan of Plato, and this and that, but it is really kind of the taken lens that we have been following through, that follows, for example, the hierarchy, the pyramid, the placement of some kinds of like anthropocentric logic, that distinct human animal, the distinct elite with mass culture that doesn't really consider that kind of blurring that complexity that has been happening. And so I was just wondering, what's your thoughts on this, even though you've been saying that, but
Okay, so not a fan of Plato, Not a fan of the Catholic Church at all. Big fan of Aristotle. Big fan. And not because I believe what he's saying is true at all. I don't, it's just because what I've been saying is when you start to read, you know, and you read other people that are reading him, it really does have an echo in the things, in the kind of politics that are happening today. And to me, it's very amazing to be able to read something that some guy said, again, 2,400 years ago, and be like, it's not that he was right. It's the fact that all the people from then on to here have thought he was right, that they're replicating and commenting and redoing his work in such a way that his view survives consciously or unconsciously on very basic things, on like what is to be human and what is not to be human, right? So obviously, I do not agree on the pyramid of human. Again, I've seen my cat and completely human. But if you see politics, and if you see the way politics are arranged, especially in Western society, they have more to do with Aristotle than to what I think of my cat, and maybe to what we all think about our cats or dogs, right? So, but my problem lies there, and that's why fan of Aristotle. Again, not saying he was right, but the way he has survived. Again, if you read him in Agamben's work, you're like, shit, yeah, this is exactly what's happening, right, with the migrants and the camps, and this is exactly what we're doing. Again, whether it's conscious or not. I'm not saying, what's the name of this household in Florida? I'm not saying Ron DeSantis has read Aristotle, but the way in which he proceeds and the way in which he talks about things and people perceive those things he talked have a certain echo there, like the way our societies have been arranged, right? So that's what I find fascinating, because, and it's also there in the images, and that's what I like as an artist. Like when you see these images, when you see what images are chosen to put on the newspaper to say migrants are arriving or migrants are leaving or Karen or migrants, etc. It's images that perfectly agree with the type of imaginary that has been described in this tradition.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like, of course, there's some echo, there's persistence of this kind of paradigm that, like, to some extent, majorly lead us to many of the crises and the injustice and inequality that we're trying to solve. But using the same paradigm to try to face and solve and rethink this could maybe lead to more problems, but maybe like many of us, we're trying to shift the paradigm, shift that structure, maybe to think, for example, to go back to the migrant argument, not to think about this in terms of a base need for beauty, and instead of looking at some kind of true beauty, which also is an idealist assumption based on some kind of universal human, and which is male, which is Western, many things like that. But maybe think of it in terms of the network, in terms of the blurring, in terms of the complexity that can take us to a different perspective and different view.
Oh no, I completely agree with you. My only point is all of those perspectives are usually huge entelechs, and they're beautiful. They are. Like if you read Kant on emancipation and on the cosmopolitan future, if you read Rawls on justice, if you read the most complex works of feminism, they are completely right and completely beautiful. But my question is, how accessible are they for a beautiful life of the most? That's my only question, right? In complete agreement to all of that, right? Again, it's very hard to read into Rawls' theory of justice and democracy and not say, this is the way, right? This is the way it has to be done. It's beautiful. This is like complete. This is no loose ends. Wow, this guy was amazing, right? But how accessible is it? How democratic is it? Ideally, it's beautifully democratic. It's the most democratic ever. But the people on the land, right? The people walking to and I think it's very hard to ask these people the people. The same thing that has been asked since the French Revolution, right? Which is wait. It eventually will come, right? Like if we just keep chipping at it, it eventually will come. This project is amazing, and we're not there yet because we need a shitload of people to be educated and to go to university. And once we get that, right? Once everybody goes to university, they won't vote for Trump. And it just doesn't happen. Right? So my only question is how accessible is this? And I'm not saying we should stop teaching it at all, because it's beautiful in its own mental image, in its own mental right. Right? But what about all these other things? Right? That are also moving people. So maybe we think it's not the right way to move people, or maybe we think this other way is the best way to move people, but we can't just disregard what is moving a shitload of people as not the way to go, right? We can't be like, fashion is not the way to go. I know everybody loves it, and I know everybody loves dressing, and I know everybody loves dressing differently and creating their identities and going to Greenpoint and you know, and being different. But let's disregard that, because that is not the way to go, right? That's why I was saying I'm just thinking about uniformity as a gatekeeping or the right way to do things, right? Orthos, again, the right way to think, as just not letting us see what is happening and what people do have access to. That would be the, maybe I didn't express it that way. I'm sorry. It's been a tough week.
That's a good place for wrap it up.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Good night. And those are folks who need to sign the continuing ed forms that are out there.
Really? Okay. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.